I want to start with a paradox that I've just been turning over and over in my head while reviewing the research for this deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
We live in a society that is, absolutely obsessed with safety. We buy smart locks. We have doorbell cameras that, tell us if a leaf blows across the porch.
Right. We track our family members on apps.
Exactly. We track our kids. We track our partners just to make sure they got home okay. We spend billions, literally billions of dollars trying to sanitize our lives of any and all risk.
And yet,
The moment we feel safe behind those double locked doors, what do? We voluntarily plug into a feed of the most gruesome, the most terrifying, and the most detailed accounts of human malevolence we can possibly find.
it's the safe danger contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's fascinating. We are biologically wired to flee from a predator in the wild, but when that predator is trapped inside a book or, a podcast app, we run right toward it.
We run toward it.
We have, in essence, built this massive industrial complex around packaging our own worst nightmares as leisure activities.
And industrial complex is absolutely the right term for it. Today, we're doing a deep dive into true crime. And I want to be really clear about the scope here because the reading list you sent over was just massive.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We aren't just talking about, the modern podcast hosts solving cold cases in their basements. We are looking at this as a specific nonfiction genre that examines actual crimes, the actions of the perpetrators, and this is the key, their motives.
Right.
It's that pivot from just what happened to why did they do it that really defines the entire genre for me.
Right. And even within that definition, there's a huge spectrum that we need to navigate today. On one end, you have the strictly journalistic approach.
The court reporter.
The court reporter, the investigative journalist who sticks rigidly to the known facts, the who, what, when, where. But as we move through the history, which we're about to do, we see the rise of the more speculative style.
And what do you mean by speculative?
That's where the author inserts themselves into the narrative. They start offering personal theories, maybe filling in the blanks of a killer's internal monologue.
Ah, I see.
And that is precisely where the line between history and, entertainment starts to get very, very blurry.
It's interesting you mention history because I think the average listener, and frankly, myself included before this week, assumes true crime is a relatively modern invention.
Sure, most people do.
Maybe we trace it back to the noir era of the 1940s, or if we're being generous, maybe the penny press of the Victorian era. But the timeline you've laid out here just completely upends that whole idea.
It really does.
We aren't starting in London or New York. We are starting in the late Ming Dynasty. In China.
We are. If we want to find the true roots of a commercialized interest in crime stories, we have to look at the Book of Swindles.
The Book of Swindles.
This is a collection published around 1617 by a man named Zhang Yinyu. And it's fascinating because it's not about the bloody murders we obsess over today. It was focused on fraud.
Which actually makes a lot of sense if you look at the context of the Ming Dynasty at that time. I was reading the background notes on this, and it was a period of massive economic expansion, but also a lot of social anxiety.
That's the key. You had merchants traveling further than ever before. You had them dealing with total strangers carrying silver. The stranger all of a sudden became a figure of deep suspicion.
So it was a world where these traditional social bonds were kind of fraying because of commerce.
Precisely. So the Book of Swindles wasn't just, a bit of fun entertainment. It was almost a survival guide.
A how-to manual for not getting ripped off.
Basically, yeah. It featured these incredible stories about court officials getting duped, merchants being tricked out of their cargo. It spoke to that very specific, very new anxiety of how do I navigate a world where anyone I meet might be trying to cheat me?
It reminds me of the modern obsession with con artist stories.
Oh, absolutely.
Things like the Tinder swindler or inventing Anna. We like to think those are new phenomena. But Zhang Yunyu was doing the exact same thing 400 years ago. He was tapping into the fear of the counterfeit person.
And around the same time, we also see the rise of what's called gong and xiaoshuo, or court case fiction.
The Magistrate Bao stories.
Yes, the Magistrate Bao stories.
Yeah.
These are absolute classics. Magistrate Bao was a real historical figure from the Song Dynasty, but by the 16th century, he had become this almost Sherlock Holmes-type figure in Chinese fiction.
Right.
These stories blended real accounts with, sometimes supernatural elements or really exaggerated logic.
Yeah.
But the core hook was the procedural aspect.
The nuts and bolts of the
The
investigation.
nuts and bolts. The audience wanted to see the crime committed. They wanted to understand the villain's logic. And then, crucially, they wanted to see the restoration of order through the court.
That restoration of order piece feels so crucial. It's the comforting part of the whole genre, isn't it? But if we swing the lens over to Britain around the same time, roughly 1550 to 1700, we see something a little less orderly and a lot grittier.
Yes, we do. We see the explosion of street literature.
This is the era where the printing press really starts to democratize information.
Or at least democratize scandal. You have
Mhm.
pamphlets, broadsides, and these little things called chapbooks just flooding the streets of London.
And what's interesting is, contrary to the idea that this was just, trash for the poor, the research shows these were purchased mostly by the artisan class and above.
Yeah, you needed a bit of disposable income, and, you had to be literate to consume them. It wasn't for everyone.
And the content was incredibly graphic. But what really struck me in the source material was the format of the execution ballads.
The ballads, yes.
These weren't just news reports. They were songs, verses that were posted on town walls, and they were often written from the perpetrator's point of view.
That is the psychological link to today. That's the through line. Even in 1650, people were not satisfied with just knowing a murder happened. They wanted to inhabit the mind of the murderer.
They wanted the why.
They wanted the why. These ballads would be written as these first-person laments. I did this terrible thing. Here is why I did it. Here is my deep regret. It was an attempt to humanize the monster, or at least to understand the internal mechanism of the sin.
It's the 17th century version of the breathless televised interview with a serial killer.
Absolutely. We want to hear the voice.
But as we move into the 19th century, the tone shifts a bit. It stops being just street gossip and it starts becoming, it becomes almost an intellectual exercise. And for that, we have to talk about Thomas de Quincey.
De Quincey is pivotal. In 1827, he published an essay with the most provocative title you can possibly imagine, on murder considered as one of the fine arts.
An incredible title.
Now, De Quincey was a satirist, and he was being incredibly dark, but he was introducing a completely new way of looking at crime.
It's such a biting piece of writing. He's essentially mocking the way the public and the intellectuals of his time were treating these sensational crimes as if they were theater.
Right. He talks about the composition of a murder, the aesthetics of it.
The aesthetics of a murder.
It's shocking.
Mm.
He was pointing out that once the initial moral horror passes, society tends to treat the crime as a spectacle to be critiqued. Was it a good murder? Was it dramatic enough?
He was holding a mirror up to the audience.
Exactly. And in doing so, he kind of gave permission for the intellectual class to engage with true crime as a subject of serious study, not just the guilty pleasure.
And following that thread, we get William Roughead in Scotland. The notes describe him as the dean of the genre. He was a lawyer, correct?
A Scottish lawyer, yes.
Mm.
For 6 decades, he attended every major murder trial in Edinburgh and wrote these incredibly detailed, dryly witty essays about them.
Wow, 6 decades.
He collected them in a book called Classic Crimes. And Roughead, he treated the murder trial as a sociological event. He wasn't just looking at the blood and guts. He was looking at the jury, the judge, the witnesses. He was chronicling the whole human comedy that surrounds a tragedy.
And across the pond, we have the Americans trying to catch up. In 1807, we get Henry Tufts publishing his memoir, a narrative of the life, adventures, travels, and sufferings of Henry Tufts.
Which is a great title, by the way.
It's an amazing title.
It is, and it's likely the first extensive biography of an American criminal. Tufts was a thief, a swindler, a soldier, a deserter, you name it. His book laid the groundwork for that American anti-hero narrative, the outlaw who tells his own story.
So by the time we hit the 20th century, all the ingredients are there.
They're all on the table.
We have the court case structure from China, the psychological curiosity from the British ballads, and then this new intellectual detachment from De Quincey.
Which brings us to the boom, the golden age of print.
If you walked past a newsstand in New York in, say, 1935, the visual noise would just be overwhelming. And a huge chunk of that real estate was taken up by true crime magazines.
The scale of this is something I think people often forget. The first dedicated magazine, True Detective, launched in 1924. By the time we get to the pre-WWII era, there are roughly 200 different titles on the stands.
Wait, 200 titles?
200 different magazines.
That is just market saturation. That's incredible.
It's massive. And between them, they were selling 6 million copies. per month.
6 million a month.
True Detective alone was moving 2 million units. This wasn't a niche hobby. This was mass entertainment on a scale we can barely imagine. And the aesthetic was very, very specific, the pulp art style.
Oh, absolutely. The covers are iconic. It's almost always a damsel in distress, a shadowy figure lurking, a gun. It's lurid. But the notes mention that as the decades went on, specifically into the 60s, the imagery got nastier.
It did. In the 20s and 30s, there was a sort of noir mystery to it, a sense of suspense. By the 60s, it became much more explicitly violent and sexualized.
How so?
The covers started featuring women in much more compromising, terrified positions. It became less about the detective work and more about the act of victimization. Eventually, though, that market just collapsed.
Why?
Tastes changed, television came along, interest just waned in the 70s, and True Detective finally folded for good in 1996.
But just as the lowbrow pulp magazines were dying out, the genre was putting on a tuxedo and trying to get into the country club.
That's a great way to put it.
This is where we see the transition to literary true crime. And Edmund Pearson seems to be the bridge figure here.
Pearson is the direct link between De Quincey and the modern era we're in now. He was a librarian, a very proper, buttoned-up American intellectual, but he was obsessed with murder cases, specifically the Lizzie Borden case.
And he started publishing true crime essays in The New Yorker and Vanity Fair.
Which is a huge signal. You don't put trash in The New Yorker.
No, he was validating the topic for the upper class.
Exactly. He was basically saying, it is okay for you to read about an axe murder, provided the prose is elegant enough. And that whole effort to elevate the genre really culminates in 1965 with the publication of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood.
This book changes everything, and I think we need to unpack why it was such a massive shift. It wasn't just that it was a bestseller, it was the technique Capote used. He called it the nonfiction novel.
And that term is the key to everything. Before Capote, true crime was usually written either as a dry journalistic report or a sensationalist shout from the tabloids.
Right, one extreme or the other.
Capote applied the tools of high fiction internal monologue, setting the scene with rich detail, extensive dialogue, nonlinear storytelling, to a brutal, senseless murder of the Clutter family in Kansas.
He made the killers, Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, into fully realized literary characters.
He did. And that brings up the first major ethical friction that we really need to highlight in this whole story. Capote didn't just report on them, he befriended them. He spent years getting inside their heads.
And the criticism, which has only grown louder over the years, is that he manipulated them, or at the very least manipulated the narrative, to get a better ending for his book.
The ending of the book, the execution of Smith and Hickok, was the ending Capote needed for his masterpiece. There's a lot of documentation to suggest that he was desperate for the execution to happen so he could finally finish the book.
That's chilling.
It is. It established a very dangerous precedent. The writer who is more invested in the story arc than in the human reality of the situation. But commercially, it was a blockbuster. It proved to publishers that true crime could win awards and make millions of dollars.
And frankly, it paved the way for the specific obsession that completely dominates the genre today.
The serial killer.
The serial killer.
This is the monster subgenre, and statistically, it is a complete and total anomaly. Murder makes up less than 20% of reported violent crime, and serial murder is a fraction of a percent of that.
It's vanishingly rare.
Vanishingly. But if you look at the bookshelves, serial killers make up about 40% of the tales.
So we are actively ignoring the 99% of crime, the domestic assaults, the gang violence, the robberies, to focus on the Hannibal Lecters of the world.
Because the serial killer represents the other, the unknowable evil. It's a much more compelling story. Books like Helter Skelter, which remains the best-selling true crime book of all time.
Still, to this day.
Still. Or Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me, about Ted Bundy. These books aren't just about crime. They are about the terror that the person sitting next to you, the charming, handsome guy, might be a monster.
Anne Rule's case is particularly wild because she knew Bundy. She worked at a suicide crisis center with him.
Right next to him. That intimacy is what sold the book.
It's that proximity to evil.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But while we have these high watermarks of literature like Capote and Rule, the success of the genre also birthed something much, much cheaper. The instant book.
The airport paperback.
Yeah.
You know, the look-black cover, bold red font, usually titled Death in the Suburbs or The Freeway Killer.
Those are the ones. They were churned out by journalists immediately after a high-profile verdict. And the criticism here is, I think, very valid. They're formulaic. They treat the tragedy as a commodity to be harvested as quickly as possible.
There's no De Quincey-style reflection here.
None at all. It's just content.
And content demands visuals. As we move into our next section, the technology shifts, and the audience follows right along. We have to talk about how the camera completely changed the equation.
Visual media changes the intimacy. Reading about a crime is one thing. Seeing the crime scene photos or the tearful confession on camera, that's another thing entirely. And the landmark here is, without question, Errol Morris's documentary The Thin Blue Line in 1988.
I rewatched parts of this recently for our prep, and what really stands out is how stylized it is. The music by Philip Glass, the lighting. But the big controversy at the time was his use of reenactments.
It was scandalous in the documentary world back then. The purists argued that by hiring actors to play out the shooting of the police officer, Morris was fabricating truth.
He was making a movie, not a documentary.
That was the argument. But Morris's point was that the official truth, the police report, the court verdict, was a lie. He used the reenactments to show the contradictions of the evidence, to show how different witness accounts just didn't add up.
It worked. I mean, it actually worked. The film helped get Randall Adams released from prison.
It did. It proved that a stylized, even subjective retelling could sometimes get closer to the real truth than a dry recitation of so-called facts. It legitimized the cinematic true crime documentary.
But while the U.S. was having these high-minded debates about documentary ethics, Hong Kong cinema in the 90s was taking things in a very different direction.
A much more visceral direction. The Hong Kong boom was fascinating. You had the rise of the Category 3 films, which is their rating for 18-plus content.
So extremely graphic.
Extremely. Films like The Untold Story or Dr. Lamb, these were based on real, horrific serial killers, but they were filmed with the aesthetic of a full-blown slasher movie. Gory, sensational, and incredibly popular.
And then you also had more mainstream films like Crime Story with Jackie Chan.
Right, which was based on a real-life kidnapping of a businessman. So you see this huge range from the art house exploitation film to the big-budget action movie, all drawing from the same well of real crime.
It's interesting because it shows that this fascination isn't just a Western phenomenon, it's global. But back in the U.S., the real shift in our consumption habits comes with cable TV, the 24-hour news and entertainment cycle.
The networks realize that crime is the ultimate sticky content. You just can't look away. Investigation Discovery, or ID, built an entire empire on this principle. But the most telling business move for me was the network Oxygen.
I remember when Oxygen launched. It was Oprah's network, wasn't it? It was supposed to be lifestyle, yoga, talk shows aimed at women.
Exactly. It was empowerment television. But the executives looked at the data and they saw this strange anomaly.
What was it?
The reruns of their one or two crime shows, like Snapped, were absolutely crushing the yoga shows in the ratings. It wasn't even close.
So they followed the money.
They followed the money. In 2017, they completely pivoted. They rebranded the entire Oxygen network as a specialized true crime network. They stopped trying to tell women how to live their best lives and started showing them in detail how lives end.
Wow, that pivot speaks volumes about the audience, which we are definitely going to get to. But the final evolution of the visual medium before we get to audio is streaming. Netflix and Making a Murderer in 2015.
Making a Murderer introduced the binge. Before that, you'd watch a 60-minute episode of Dateline or 48 Hours and you'd go to bed.
Right, it was appointment viewing.
Making a Murderer gave you 10 hours of a dense, complex legal nightmare and said, good luck stopping. It turned a murder trial into an immersive weekend event. It proved that audiences had the attention span for the minutiae of the justice system as long as it was packaged correctly.
Which is the perfect setup for the medium that I think really defines the current moment, the podcast. We are in the golden age of audio, and it is absolutely built on the back of crime.
It really is, and we can pinpoint the exact moment it happened. October 2014, the launch of Serial.
We all know the numbers. 5 million downloads faster than any podcast before it, hundreds of millions since. It was a cultural phenomenon. But looking at the critique of Serial, what made it so distant wasn't just the case of Adnan Syed, it was the storytelling mode.
That's the key innovation. Sarah Koenig wasn't a voice of God narrator telling you the definitive answer.
No, not at all. She was transparent about her own uncertainty.
She would say, I don't know what to think about this. Or I've flip-flopped on this 3 times today. That intimacy, that vulnerability, made the listener feel like a co-investigator. It shifted the dynamic from a lecture to a conversation.
And that just unlocked the floodgates.
The floodgates opened. Suddenly you had My Favorite Murder, Dirty John. Up and vanished. The whole landscape changed overnight.
And Apple Podcasts eventually had to create a dedicated true crime category in 2019.
They had to, because the shows were clogging up every other category: history, news, even comedy.
But here's where we need to look at the demographics, because the stereotype of the gorehound might be a teenage boy in his bedroom, but the reality of the true crime podcast listener is very, very different.
It is overwhelmingly female. The 2019 data showed that 73% of true crime podcast consumers in the U.S. are women.
73%, that is not a margin of error, that is a complete domination of the audience. So we have to ask the uncomfortable but necessary question. Why are women primarily the ones consuming stories about the brutalization of women?
There are two main competing theories here, and they're both pretty compelling. The first is what's called the survival instinct theory.
Okay.
This is supported by research from psychologists like Amanda Vickery. She found that women are specifically drawn to stories that contain survival information.
So it's educational, like here is how to spot the red flags in a first date, or here is how to escape from the trunk of a car.
Essentially, yes. It's a form of rehearsal. The argument is that women, on average, live with a higher baseline fear of sexual and physical violence than men do. Listening to these stories is a way of simulating the worst-case scenario and mentally preparing for it from a safe distance.
So it's not just entertainment, it's a strategy.
It's a kind of grim precautionary strategy.
But I have to push back on that slightly. Is it actually making anyone safer? Or is it just a form of anxiety management? Because the other theory is purely physiological. It's the adrenaline junkie theory.
That's the flip side of the coin. The fear response. When you hear these horrific stories, our bodies release adrenaline and cortisol, the fight-or-flight response kicks in. Right.
But because we are safe on our couch or in our car, we get the chemical rush without the actual danger. It's a high, similar to riding a roller coaster or watching a horror movie.
And podcasts are perfectly built for that.
They're perfectly engineered to deliver these hits. They're serialized. They use sound design, cliffhangers, and dramatic music to heighten tension. They are designed to give you these dopamine hits over and over again.
So it's either a survival guide or a horror movie for your ears, or, more likely, some combination of both.
I think that's right.
But this brings us to the most critical part of this whole deep dive. We aren't just consuming this stuff in a vacuum. The true crime industrial complex has real-world consequences. We need to talk about the impact.
The impact is profound, and it really cuts both ways. On the positive side, you have the citizen detective phenomenon. We have the incredible case of the Jinx on HBO.
The Robert Durst hot mic moment. The hot mic moment. Killed them all, of course. He muttered it to himself in the bathroom, not realizing his microphone was still hot. The filmmakers discovered that audio. It led directly to his arrest.
You can't get a clearer line than that from entertainment product to justice served.
You can't. And you also found that stat from Australia regarding Crime Stoppers that really highlights this.
Yes. Between 2012 and 2017, the number of reports to Crime Stoppers in Australia that led to actual charges being pressed doubled.
It doubled.
And authorities there directly attributed this spike to the massive popularity of true crime podcasts. People are learning to pay attention. They are looking at the details in their own communities. They're realizing that they might hold a piece of the puzzle.
That is the best case scenario.
Yeah.
The audience becomes an army of witnesses.
It is. But there is a much, much darker side to this. We have to talk about the Nebraska study and what sociologists call the mean world syndrome.
This is where that educational argument starts to fall apart. The 2011 study out of Nebraska found a direct, undeniable correlation. People who consume large amounts of nonfiction crime shows have a significantly increased fear of being a victim themselves.
So even if crime rates are historically low, which they are in many places, the heavy listener feels like they're living in a war zone.
Exactly. Their perception of reality becomes distorted by the content they consume. Their world feels meaner, more dangerous than it actually is.
And this isn't just a personal anxiety issue, is it? It translates directly into politics.
It does. The study found that these same viewers had increased support for the death penalty.
Wow.
And at the same time, decreased support for the criminal justice system's due process. They were willing to trade civil liberties for a perceived sense of security.
That is massive. It means this entertainment is actually shifting the electorate toward more punitive, more aggressive policies. We are literally voting based on the fear that the podcast gave us.
And that leads directly to the ethical criticism of trash culture. Are we, as consumers, complicit in the exploitation of real people's worst moments?
I think about the families constantly when I engage with this stuff. The author Jack Miles writes about this, the concept of narrative imposition. Imagine being a mother whose child was murdered. That is the worst moment of your life. And then 10 years later, a podcaster decides to make it into a 6-part series with, catchy theme music and advertisements for mattresses in the middle.
It's re-traumatization for profit. The victims' families don't get a royalty check. They don't get editorial control. They just get their deepest trauma dredged up for our amusement, for our commute.
There is a growing movement of victims' families asking for the right to be forgotten, but the public's appetite is just voracious.
It seems to be.
And the final layer of this distortion, and maybe the most insidious, is the issue of truth itself. We call it true crime, but how true is it, really? We mentioned Capote maybe fixing his ending, but this happens constantly.
It's called narrative shaping. A good story needs a clear villain, a pure victim, and a satisfying climax. Real life is messy, it's boring, and it's often unresolved.
So writers and producers, they smooth the edges.
They smooth the edges. They might leave out exculpatory evidence because it ruins the flow of the episode. The author Christiana Gregorio analyzed this. She calls it tabloidization. You can read 2 different books about the exact same killer, and the facts presented will be completely different because the authors are prioritizing the drama over the historical record.
So we are potentially judging real people who are in real prisons based on a fictionalized version of their worst actions.
We are. We are turning the justice system into fan fiction.
That is a very sobering thought to land on. We've traced this incredible arc from the 17th century moral pamphlets of London and the fraud stories of the Ming Dynasty.
Through the pulp magazines, the literary reinvention by Capote, the visual explosion of cable TV.
All the way to the podcast in your earbuds right now.
It's a journey that shows one constant. We are obsessed with the dark side of human nature. We always have been.
But the so what? Here, the big takeaway is that this obsession isn't benign. It isn't passive. It shapes how we see our neighbors. It shapes how we vote. And it shapes our very concept of justice.
It drives tips to the police, but it also drives paranoia in the voting booth.
And it leaves us, the listeners, with the responsibility to ask how we are consuming it. Are we bearing witness to a tragedy, or are we just gawking at the car crash?
That's the question.
And that is the question I want to leave you with. If the authors and podcasters we love are blurring the lines between journalism and horror fiction just to keep us hooked, are we actually learning anything about crime? Or are we just participating in a sophisticated form of voyeurism that treats real lives as props for our own adrenaline fix?
And if we enjoy it?
And if we enjoy it, if we are sitting here waiting for that next episode to drop, does that make us complicit in the trash culture that critics warn about?
It's an uncomfortable reflection, but a very necessary one.
Something to mull over before you hit play on the next episode? Thanks for diving in with us.
See you next time.